Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, a place for students looking for the informed simplicity on the far side of complexity. Today I have a great guest, and before we get into the interview, just a quick reminder that if you enjoy this podcast, go ahead and subscribe and tell one friend. All right, without further ado, our interview. Today I have Jeff Zeig, who I am just over the moon. I don't know if people still say that, but I'm over the moon to have an hour to talk with him. He's done a lot of really interesting work, especially with the Milton Erickson Foundation, and really studying the art of making therapy impactful. So before we get into any of that, I would love for you to say hello and give us a little bit of background on how you got into the field of psychotherapy.
Sure. When I was designed for the field of psychotherapy. I'm my mother's surrogate. If my mother had had the opportunity, she would have been a therapist, and she enjoyed therapy. She was in therapy for most of my adult life, and was a consumer as well as an advocate for therapy. And my father and mother would come to all of the meetings that I organized. They were not educated people. Both of them finished high school, but they enjoyed seeing the meetings. So when I was in high school and you had to put in your yearbook, what is it that you're designing yourself for? I put in that I'd like to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist.
So you knew early on.
Yeah, actually, there was a formative event where I don't remember the reason, but when I was around an early adolescent, my mother gave me the opportunity to be in therapy. And so I went to group therapy, and the therapist was just so terrible that I knew at that moment that if I ever became a therapist, I would never approach that miserable standard.
What was the therapist doing that was so bad?
It just was incapable of being empathic. It was, you had a 14-year-old, 13-year-old boy, and you weren't doing anything directive, anything that was guiding me. So it was more of a psychodynamic kind of approach, and I was lost in the lack of direction.
Yeah. Hmm. So how did you go from, that kid, you had that experience
Mm-hmm.
that led to him saying, okay, let me go into this field? How'd you go from that into like college and on?
Yeah. Well, when I was in college, I majored in extracurricular activities. And
Not a bad
so
major.
I went to Michigan State University, and probably in the yearbook for 1969, when I graduated, I had more extracurricular activities than any of the thousands of people who graduated that year. So I was in student government, and one of the things that was interesting to me was doing drug education. So I established a university-wide drug education committee, and we joined together with a couple of other organizations and established a crisis intervention center called the Listening Ear, which exists to this day in Lansing, Michigan.
Wow.
And that was an introduction to empathy training. As one of the volunteers who would be online to take telephone calls, I learned empathy. And that was the mainstay of the approach for guiding people. And that fascinated me. And then I got a job working with psychotic patients after I graduated at a community hospital, and that fascinated me. And this was the time of the Vietnam War, so a lot of my service work was organized around draft resistance and helping people to understand their choices in regard to facing the draft and going to Vietnam. And then I applied to graduate school. When I moved to California, I was also working at a psychiatric hospital. I fell in love with schizophrenia, and I found great joy in working with people who were really severely disturbed. And then I
What
applied to
what
graduate
about
school.
that? What about that really stuck out to you? Because that's not something most people want, like think I'm gonna work on this area.
I was, good at speaking schizophrenic. I could get in there with them and
Uh,
resonate.
your
We would
old
have
your old therapist really messed you up, huh?
No, no. We would have crazy talking contests with the patients. We'd have posturing contests like it was an Olympics. And I was one of the chief therapists at a subacute residential treatment center. So we could establish a program for working with severely disturbed patients that weren't disturbed enough to be in the county hospital, but they weren't ready to be in a board and care home in the community either. So,
Wow. Yeah, that's not, I mean, I've done a little bit of work with that. I feel like more of my work is on the substance abuse end.
That's tough work.
It is tough work, but it's also very different than, that work. And it sounds like for you that was a lot of fun. And my experience has been people often get bogged down by that work. So
well, I could give you a case if you'd like.
Yeah.
So I was working at the state hospital in Phoenix, and this was after I got my PhD. And I had a resident, the resident's name was John, and he was following me. We were doing therapy with the patient. The patient's name was John. And our job was this was a chronic unit that I was working on.
Yeah.
And our job was to get John from the hospital into the board and care home. And he was doing very well. And then one morning we came in and John was floridly psychotic. He just couldn't say a clear word. And I am being a very kind and gentle, humble Jeff Zeig. John, are you worried about going to the board and care home? Did something scare you last night? Are you okay? And nothing. He's just talking floridly psychotic. And finally, I realized that being a very nice Jeff Zeig, a humble Jeff Zeig, wasn't the best way of approaching this. So I said, okay, John, you and I are going to have a crazy talking contest. And John, the doctor, is going to be the judge, and we'll talk crazy for 5 minutes. And then John will tell us who did a better job. And so I talked crazy with the patient for 5 minutes, and I'm a little competitive, and I was doing my best. And at the end of 5 minutes, we turned to John, the doctor. He looked at me, he said, sorry, Jeff. John won. I'm a little pissed off now because of my competitive nature. And so I say, okay, well, now John, the doctor, John, the patient, you talk crazy for 5 minutes. And I'll be the judge. And after 5 minutes, I looked at John, the patient, smugly, and I said, I'm sorry, John. John, the doctor, did a better job of talking crazy. And then I said, well, fair is fair. And I took off my watch. I gave my watch to John, the patient. And I said, now, John, the doctor, and I will talk crazy for 5 minutes. And you be the judge about which one of us did the better job. And so the patient is, using some akathisia movements and, acting as the timekeeper, staring at the watch. He let us go on for about 6 or 7 minutes. And finally we stopped him and we said, okay, who won? And he looked up at me and he made his first cogent statement of the day. He said smugly, sorry, Jeff, John won. But the idea there was Erickson and utilization. And if somebody is using schizophrenic dialogue to distance, you can go in there and use schizophrenic dialogue to get close.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of utilizing, not analyzing what the client is bringing to you, what exists in the total weave of the therapy situation, learning how to join into that moment rather than try to instruct someone in some cognitive way about how to get out of that situation.
Yeah. And had you met Erickson at that point, or was this before?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I went to Phoenix. This was 1978 when I moved to Phoenix. I had met Erickson in 1973.
Okay.
And that was after I had completed my master's degree, before I finished my PhD.
So did you have a master's thesis?
I had a master's in clinical psychology in San Francisco. And then I had written to Erickson, and I had read the only book that was out at the time was a compendium of his papers called Advanced Techniques of Hypnosis and Psychotherapy.
By Jay Haley, is that, I think?
That was edited by Jay Haley. Good for you. Yeah, that book is no longer in print because it's been subsumed into the collected works of Milton Erickson.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then you went on to do your doctorate. What did you do your what did you do your dissertation on?
I did my dissertation as a scientific study. It was hemisphere laterality, hypnosis, and it was a study that was somewhat neurologically based. It was way before we had functional MRIs or equipment like that. So I was using bilateral tympanic temperature at the eardrum to measure regional cerebral blood flow and to see if there was an effect on hemisphere-specific tasks and if there was an effect on high and low hypnotic subjects. And fortunately, I got an effect and got my study done. But at the time, I was orienting towards academics. I thought I would try to apply to a university and be a professor. And so I wanted a dissertation that was based on science, rather a dissertation that was based on change in psychotherapy, which seemingly to me at the time was a weaker science.
So what, can you talk a little, I'm always interested in people's dissertations. Usually people do really interesting research and then they go off in another field for their actual career. Mm-hmm. So what did you find? What was the difference between high hypnotizability and low hypnotizability?
Good question. Nobody has ever asked me about that. So thank you. It was that high hypnotic subjects seemed, by extrapolating meaning out of the data, to suppress their left hemisphere. And so that was the best that we could say from the fact that there was a difference in tympanic temperature, which we took to be an indicator of arterial blood flow. And but it wasn't something that I pursued. It's just that we had a social psychology department that was avid about using tympanic temperature to say something about the brain. These are thermistors that were used especially at the time in anesthesiology rather than monitoring somebody's esophageal temperature, which is more of a core condition for understanding temperature during anesthesia. Some anesthesiologists were using tympanic temperature, which is a very fine thread, a thermistor that you just place against the tympanic membrane, and it was a very sensitive measure of temperature.
Wow. How do you feel like that has held up over time, or are you not even in that field?
No, not at all. Not at all, because now we have very sophisticated ways of measuring cerebral blood flow. Yeah. At the time, there was laboratories in Sweden that were using scintillation detectors, and you had to inhale xenon gas in order to measure areas of regional cerebral blood flow. And so we were trying to use a much simpler and less invasive measure that had some, well, you know, my dissertation, which is laterality, hypnosis, and tympanic temperature, I think the literature review was 60 pages, and that is a very circumscribed area.
Right.
But
wow. So thanks. That's fascinating. I've talked to a few people who do a lot of like neurofeedback and that sort of thing, and so the physiological part of this deal is really interesting to me. And so in that, you somehow also met Milton Erickson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was learning hypnosis. I had a supervisor, and I was working at it as my internship for my master's degree at a community hospital. And I asked the psychiatrist, who was chief of the unit, could he teach me hypnosis? Seemed like something that would be interesting to learn. And unexpectedly, he said, come to my office on Saturday morning, I'll hypnotize you. And I went, oh, because I had all of these misconceptions about hypnosis. But I showed up dutifully, and I was nervous. So he started to do an induction with me, and I was drumming my fingers nervously, unaware, on the arm of the chair. And he said to me, watch the movement of your fingers, notice the rhythm, notice how the pattern of movement can change, notice how it can slow down. And that was the first example I ever had of utilization. And I said, wow, this is pretty interesting. What should I read? And he said, well, read Milton Erickson. And I said, who? He said, well, read Milton Erickson. And so I sent away for this book, Advanced Techniques of Hypnosis and Therapy. I was a poor graduate student. That book was expensive at the time.
It still is
And
expensive. I try to get a copy.
that doesn't pay. It doesn't pay, because if you go to the Erickson Foundation, where you can get the collected works in 16 volumes, that was a selection of some of Erickson's papers that was chosen eventually by Jay Haley and some other people who had preceded him. But that's an unnecessary book now. It's great if you're a collector and you want a classic.
You don't have to have it.
No, you don't have to have it. So when I read Advanced Techniques of Hypnosis and Psychotherapy, I went, again, because what Erickson was doing was light years beyond anything that I was conceiving as psychotherapy. I had been primarily trained in empathic listening skills, using a model from Kharkov and Truax that was taught to me at Michigan State University. And I thought I would be a Rogerian for the rest of my life. And then I started to get interested in transactional analysis. I had training with Bob and Mary Goulding, who were experts at transactional analysis and Gestalt therapy, and I went to their training for a year. And during that time, I went to Phoenix to start studying with Milton Erickson, and then I made frequent trips from 73 to 78, as frequently as I could, to visit Erickson in Phoenix. And eventually in 78, 2 years before he died, I moved to Phoenix. Effectively, I took over Erickson's practice. He was retired. He didn't have many people to refer patients to. I got a job working at the state hospital, and then he started referring patients to me. And within a little over a year, I was in full-time private practice, really courtesy of Erickson.
Yeah. I want to slow down just for a second and go back to something that you said. That
slow down. I don't know that speed.
So interesting, because it seems like for you, you're also a lifelong learner, right? Even before you met Erickson, which sort of changed the trajectory of your career, you were pretty consistent and diligent in learning this thing that we call psychotherapy.
Right.
Yeah. How did that come up for you? I know that not everyone's like that. What kind of led you down that path of really being dedicated to learning this thing?
Well, what I saw in Erickson was extraordinary excellence. Now, when I met Erickson in 1973, he was confined to a wheelchair. He was effectively quadriplegic. Now, that's not quite true, because he had use of his right hand. If he would have to write, sometimes he'd have to guide his right hand with his left. He had more use of his left hand. This is the residuals of polio that he had when he was 18. And so he was ataxic, he just was moving. He couldn't control all of his muscles. His vision was double, his hearing was impaired. He was breathing laboredly by virtue of half a diaphragm and a few intercostal muscles. He was in constant chronic pain. And he just perfumed the air with joy about being alive. And I remember I was just so touched that this genius was spending time with me. I was 26 years old when I visited him. And 27, 26, 2 years old, yeah. And the second day that I was there, I was his house guest. I didn't even remember how that was arranged, but he had a bedroom that was in his office area, and I got to stay there. I was absolutely poor. I was, choked with student debt. I didn't have any money, and so he made himself available, never charged me a penny for any of the time that he spent with me, but he didn't charge many people in my generation who were seeing him then. He was clear, I'm interested in your life and not in your shekels. So Erickson was a remarkable human being. He was just so, I was so enamored with him. And the second date I was there, I had tears running down my face. I just said, Dr. Erickson, you're the most impressive human being that I have ever met. And he laughed and didn't want to be on a pedestal, even one that was made of marble. And he said, oh, I'm just another old bozo, another clown along the path of life. And so dedicated. Like, this was a man who couldn't use his body. He didn't have false teeth in his mouth. His tongue was slightly dislocated from the paralysis. And so he had to relearn how to enunciate words clearly without teeth. And this was a man who already had an actor's control of his voice. So Erickson was so meticulous, like every word was surgical, chosen, and every gesture was surgical, and the meaning of the word surgical, and the meaning of the gesture surgical. So he was the most precise communicator that I had ever met. And I spent most of the last 40 years, last 30 years, trying to model Erickson. About 10 years ago, I got a different idea, and I decided that I would model art. And that, you know, my series 5-minute video, the 5-minute tips for therapists,
Yeah.
which has 2 seasons. It's about 40 different 5-minute videos on various topics. And so if you go to YouTube and put in Jeff Zeig or 5-minute video, 5-minute tips for therapists, you can see this series. It's free.
Yeah,
And
all of my students need to go do that. Put that in the show notes.
oh, super. So the essence of that is that therapists are not using their medium to the maximum extent. That if you're a painter, you want to do something with a canvas that no painter has ever done before. And if you're a therapist, we hardly understand how to make therapy into a visual art. We certainly don't understand how to use proximity and gesture and posture and signification and metaphor. And we don't understand how to use the resources that are available in the totality of communication in order to have a strategic effect on a client who's hurting. So my area of inquiry is to help therapists to expand the use of communication. And to do that, I spent a lot of time interviewing artists. And if you have a bold approach and an interesting idea and a camera crew, you can interview a lot of people. I interviewed Stan Lee from Marvel comic books. I interviewed film directors like James Foley, who did Glengarry, Glen Ross. I interviewed Richard Sherman. He and his brother won Academy Awards for doing the music for Mary Poppins. And I would ask these people how they thought about impact within the context of their modality. I'm doing a program for a university, like a growth center in California, 1440.org. And I'm doing this in October with Rob Capello. And Rob Capello, super genius. You know whose work?
Yeah,
Rob Capello is a musician, a composer, and a musical historian. And he's the greatest deconstructionist since Leonard Bernstein of understanding how to deconstruct music into its component parts.
And let me also say this. He's also interesting. Like
boy.
I would not have thought that would be interesting. I would have thought of someone who's dry. No, he's also riveting.
He is riveting.
That's why I was blown away. He knows what he's talking about, and his presentation of it is incredible.
He was one of the featured speakers at the 2017 Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. So I invited artists I invite people from outside the field to come and give keynote presentations, because I think that if we want to advance psychotherapy, the best way to do that is to cross-fertilize it by bringing in ideas from other fields and not just try to develop psychotherapy from the inside where there is less ability to see the forest from the trees.
Yeah. Wow.
So like this program with Capello, which is somebody who has absolutely no understanding of music. I am an ignoramus. But if I can dialogue with Capello and I can say, how do you teach strategic development to a composition team? And you have a theme, like Beethoven has a theme that he introduces in the Fifth Symphony, 1, 2, 3 down. And then he strategically develops that theme across a symphony. And so, okay, if I want to teach a therapist about strategic development, and that concept sails over the person's head because they've never had a concept like that in graduate school. But if I say your media literacy is great, and you know music, and you've heard strategic development and rock and roll songs and classical music and opera, this is what strategic development is like. You already know it. Here's an example of music. This is strategic development. Now, get it as a state that you can enter into. So if you have a thought, a concept that you want your client to absorb, rather than just going bonk and presenting the concept that dee, 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 bum, bottom. You have a way of strategically developing that concept so that it has the most amount of evocative power. And strategic development is just one of the things that we can learn from music that can be applied in psychotherapy. We can learn how to use theme and variation, which is something that you've heard all the time in music. But now, how can we use that in public speaking? How can we use that when we're talking to our adolescent children? How can we use that when we're doing psychotherapy? And so there's lots of the grammar of music, the grammar of opera, the grammar of poetry, the grammar of choreography, the grammar of architecture. The underlying grammar has some themes that are things that we can bring into psychotherapy, because art is about helping people to get a conceptual realization. Art is not about giving people information. Right. You don't go to the movies because you want information. You want to have an evocative experience. So movie directors know better than we do about how to evoke alterations in mood and perspective and emotion. And if I can meet with them and help them to deconstruct the methodology that they use, and I can help therapists to understand this because of their media literacy, then this is the growing edge of my work. This is what I specialize in.
How do you help your students and people who come to your workshops to learn those sort of skills?
Yeah, well, we may listen to Beethoven's Fifth, and we may, like, I could, as a non-musical person, I could extract more than 20 underlying patterns that Beethoven was using. And then I could reference Milton Erickson, or I could reference a great public speaker like Bill Clinton. And I could say, I could make the transition from what you know to what you can now realize to what you can put into effect in life. And to tell you the truth, a lot of these things, unbeknownst to academic psychology, are studied in social psychology. So social psychology is about using implicit evocative communication and seeing the response that happens between people when we're using demand characteristics or conformity or social mimicry or any of the other facets that we learn in social psychology, and they mirror in academic research the things that composers have known since antiquity, and they use without knowledge of the fact that there is research that shows that it's true.
Yeah, I had never thought of it that way, but that is true. That is a mirror of the other.
Well, if you take, for example, I don't, I want to keep up with you. So are we doing okay together?
Yeah.
You and I? Okay. So like a foreshadowing, like if Woody Allen has a movie Match Point, and the movie begins with an operatic music, and there is a tennis net, and we're watching a ball go across the net, and then suddenly there's a slow motion scene where the ball takes a lazy arc and it hits the top of the net, and then it's suspended in space. And the narrator is talking about luck, and which way it lands may determine who wins the game. Well, 80 minutes later in the movie, the protagonist, who also happens to be an antagonist in this movie, takes a piece of jewelry, throws it to the river. It takes the same slow, lazy arc, and it hits the top of the fence and bounces up. And where it lands determines the destiny of that man. And this is foreshadowing. Now, foreshadowing is used in music, foreshadowing is used in literature, foreshadowing is used in theater. The Russian playwright Chekhov said that if the curtain opens for the first act and there's a gun over the mantle, somebody's going to get shot by the third act. Now, this is a very powerful form of strategic communication. It has been used since antiquity. Sophocles used it, and Shakespeare used it, and Spielberg used it. And no therapist other than Milton Erickson ever used this. And but if we study priming, the work of John Bargh at Yale University, a preeminent social psychologist, we know that there's research that presenting a cue increases the accessibility of the target when the target is presented later. So even though Woody Allen is doing this pro forma, because this is what great directors do, and if you read Salman Rushdie, he's doing this all the time. It's what great writers do, but no therapist other than Milton Erickson did this, and there were great dramatists who were therapists like Virginia Satir and Salvador Minuchin, and they certainly knew drama, but they never got the idea of seeding a concept prior to presenting it as a way of increasing the accessibility of that concept once the concept is presented. And Erickson was just doing this all the time. And not only across 1 hour, but even across sessions, he would seed a concept for a future session. And where there was no social psychology research then to prove that this would work. But somehow Erickson, in his own mind, or by virtue of reading great literature and understanding the literary apparatus that was put into place, which, by the way, nobody wants to do because nobody wants to read for understanding the grammar of literature. You read for enjoyment, and you read for the pleasure of being transported into a different world. You don't look at the structure of the sentence. You don't understand that this writer is using a suspensive sentence with free modifiers.
Nobody wants a joke explained.
Nobody wants a joke explained. Now, that's the difference between heaven and hell. In heaven, they tell jokes. In hell, they explain
them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I hope I'm not getting too intellectual for you.
No, I mean, I think you're answering a question that I personally have been trying to answer for a long time, because
Mhm.
you do read a lot, or I do read a lot of social science
Mhm.
sort of stuff, and there are all these sorts of effects that that they show that have great impact on people. But then when you read
Yes.
research on therapy, there's like almost, it's like they don't even know that the other exists.
No, they don't.
Um,
And the social scientists are not necessarily interested in applications. They're interested in science and what you can say about the human social system.
right.
But some applications happen. There's
Yeah.
interesting crossover. Robert Cialdini, who is at Arizona State University, wrote a book called Influence,
Yeah.
which is a very good book for therapists to read about studying how influence purveyors work and cross-referencing that with social psychology research. You know, I'm avid about learning about therapy. I have an online class. This is my third year, and I had two beta versions. We have a tremendous archive at the Erickson Foundation, one of the greatest archives of audio and video of psychotherapy in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. So I have video of Whitaker and Mnuchin and Albert Ellis and Tim Beck and, great. So I did a series on Masters of Psychotherapy, and I got 25 students, and we used Zoom, this platform that we're on now. And I would send my students a video of Carl Rogers from the 1985 Evolution of Psychotherapy Conference. And we would look at what Carl Rogers did, and then we would dust it off and try to make it more experiential and bring it into the 21st century. And so now I've increased the size of that class. I have students from all around the world. And January, we looked at Rogers, and February, we looked at Irv Polster and Gestalt therapy. And in March, we're doing Virginia Satir, and in April, we're doing Salvador Minuchin. I'm the curator of the Salvador Minuchin archives.
Really?
Sal was a friend for many years, and after he passed away, he made me the curator. So if you go to psychotherapyvideo.com,
I'm
you can.
sorry. I'm just really, like, what you're talking about is just, I think, just so cool and so fun
Yeah, and
to be
I'm
able to
learning
watch these.
because
Yeah.
I'm watching these masters. I have seen them before. I learn new things when I re-see them, and I'm continually tweaking my practice, always learning how can I increase the density of my communication to make it more powerful in reaching somebody else's heart, somebody else's soul.
Yeah, man. That's, yeah. I mean, I'm not at all on the sort of level that you are. I have been watching a few tapes on psychotherapy.net.
Yeah, wonderful.
And I tell all my students, I give them extra credit if they watch tapes, because I think it's so needed. And you do, just by watching, you pick up so much. You pick up
Yeah.
little things, and different ways to do things. I watched through a bunch of Virginia Satir tapes, and I love how she will do this thing where she'll get close. She'll get close
Mhm.
to get other people to get close. And it's remarkable what happens, just not by doing anything verbally, but by just literally bringing people in closer proximity of each other. It changes things.
Nobody made contact like Virginia Satir. She was the doyen of connection. When I had her do a keynote speech at one of my conferences, everybody left the room saying she was talking to me.
She probably was.
And she might have been. So she was fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I have in psychotherapyvideo.com a workshop by Virginia Satir. And you can go on psychotherapyvideo.com, watch this workshop. The second second section of that series is a family therapy session that Virginia does with a boy who's school refusing. The whole workshop is working with one family. and demonstrating the different techniques that Virginia used, like using parts parties and family reconstruction, and using her model of making psychotherapy into an art.
Yeah.
And that hour of Virginia with this young man, the family, an only child who's doing school with usual mother and father, and it is a peerless session of family therapy, amazing session of family therapy, also available on psychotherapyvideo.com. But if you went to psychotherapy.net and you wanted to see Irv Yalom,
Yeah.
Victor Yalom, who operates psychotherapy.net, Irv's son, did a marvelous interview series with Irv, with examples with different patients of Irv doing existential therapy, and also peerless.
Yeah, because then you also get the client perspective. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I might need to put that on my queue. Man, how do you? Well, I guess this is part of your benefit as you this is your job, so you have time to do all of this. I'm trying to fit this in between seeing clients.
Yes,
Yeah.
and seeing clients, and I travel 100,000 miles a year training therapists, mostly out of the country. And this year I'll be in Italy, I'll be in South America, I'll be in Mexico. I have been in Mexico, I'll be in China twice, I'll be in Japan, I'll be in Taiwan. Psychotherapy is an American export
Yeah.
because we
How
got
come
such a
mostly
jump
outside
on
of the
that.
country?
Well, when World War II, when Europe was decimated, psychotherapy for the first 60 years, from 1885 until World War II, was a European invention. And it was mostly happening around Vienna in Europe, around Freud and the people who followed Freud. And when Europe was decimated, in order to do therapy, you have to have a post-scarcity consciousness. If you're worried about putting bread on the table and shelter for your family, you don't care about your neurosis. You have a job to do. So you can only develop therapy in post-scarcity consciousness and post-scarcity society. And the United States was perfect after World War II. So we got a jump on developing psychotherapy, and now we continue to export it around the world. And now that China, for example, has become a post-scarcity society in many of the major cities, then my books are now translated into Chinese. And that's a very avid market for learning about psychotherapy, also learning about coaching. So they're bringing many experts to China to develop the standard, and eventually I'm sure that there'll be a more endemic form of psychotherapy that represents Chinese culture, and probably they'll be exporting to us after some decade or two.
Probably. Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I think I've seen a few other people who they do a lot of traveling overseas, China,
Mm-hmm.
Australia, and I'm always curious why that happens. Because I also feel like the U.S. is so big. Surely you could do, one in every state, but maybe not. Maybe there's more of a demand overseas as well.
More literature that's in English
Yeah.
that about psychotherapy, and so my books are in 14 languages, and that is the entree to speaking in other countries.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so my mind is blown. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Well, we have covered
We've
in a
covered a
very
lot.
condensed form a real lot. Yeah.
Covered a lot. Where do you think is a good place to start with your work? Like if
Well,
students wanted to begin to look into this, where should they start?
well, I have many lectures that are free on YouTube, and so you can access California Southern University, which I'm affiliated with, has a channel, a lot of Jeff Zeig videos that were done in studio quality. But there's other YouTube videos in the 5-minute video series. And the Erickson Foundation, erickson-foundation.org, has a press. And so 4 of my most recent books are published through the Erickson Foundation Press. There's one book on hypnotic induction for those who want to learn about that. And to me, hypnosis is the mother of experiential approaches to psychotherapy. It's not a didactic approach, an experiential approach. Then there's a second book, which is The Anatomy of an Intervention. This is one that was just translated into Chinese, which is my model of brief therapy that I've been teaching for more than 40 years. And then there's another book called Psychoaerobics that is about therapist development. And it's using techniques for training actors and systematically applying them in a graduated, systematic form to how to be a better therapist. And then there's a new book that just came out this week in ebook format called Evocation. And that is a more advanced development about evocative techniques of psychotherapy. How do you use signification? How do you use metaphor? How do you do strategic development? How do you do utilization? And that book consists of 2 transcripts of me discussing Milton Erickson. So I lay a platform of some of the evocative experiential methods, and then I use transcripts of Erickson to illustrate how those things happen in practice.
Yeah.
And then I'm working on another book right now that I hope to have finished by the end of the year, which is on attunement. And this is the strategic use of social mimicry as a precursor to empathy, that this is the socio-evolutionary biological basis of empathy, is attunement. And then I'm also working simultaneously on Erickson's biography. So I hope to finish 2 books this year, but that requires that people like yourself don't call me to do interviews so that I have time to do all of these projects.
Yeah. I'm eagerly awaiting that biography. I have it marked on my calendar.
Yeah, me too.
I'm ready for it to come out.
I've interviewed more than 100 people and many members of the Erickson family, brothers and sisters of Erickson. And it's a daunting task. You know, I'm an okay writer, but writing a biography is beyond my capacities as a writer, and I'm just doing my best to muddle my way through and try to see. Erickson was an inspirational life. And he was one of those people who was a wounded healer. I have been writing a series about my experiences with Viktor Frankl that appears in the Erickson Foundation newsletter. I've been blessed to know a lot of masters, and so I have a meta program of honoring the contribution of forebearers.
Yeah.
And the Erickson biography is a really daunting task for me, but I'm working at it, and a friend of mine gave me a grant to work on it, so that's been helpful, and hopefully I will be able to put something together by the end of the year.
Yeah. How come, and I say this because I think that you would agree with me. So I'll back up and give you a little history about me. I too was inspired early on by the work of Milton Erickson, and it really inspired me because it kind of shows you what's possible, right? It shows you what I consider to be the leading edge of therapy, and of human to human like interaction, human to human connection and presence. And so I've been on my own journey to learn and grow as a therapist. And for a long time, I couldn't get any movement. And I decided to then look at other fields. Because in other fields, you have, Mozarts, you have Michael Jordans, you have Paganini's, people who are on the far edge of their own field.
Absolutely.
And that to me brought a lot of insights, comparing these sort of like extreme individuals. And one of the questions that I keep wrestling with is, in most other fields, you do have outliers, but you have at least a series of outliers, right? You have a Mozart and you have a Beethoven, you have a Michael Jordan and you have a LeBron James. And it seems to me that we have a Milton Erickson and we have wonderful other players, right? Virginia Satir, Viktor Frankl. But it seems like there's no one else who's as far down that path as Milton Erickson was. How come you think that that is?
I think he was lucky. He had polio.
No.
And Erickson was a genius. He grew up in a family. He was one of 9 siblings. And this is a kind of salt of the earth Midwestern farm family with really good people, church-going family. And Milton Erickson was an anomaly in his own family and had a singular type of genius, an unbelievable ability to concentrate, a dedication. He really wanted to be the world's greatest psychotherapeutic communicator, and I think that he accomplished that. And he worked assiduously, like, if Steph Curry is, the best free throw shooter, one of the best free throw shooters in basketball, it's because he's practiced this so many times. And actually, I was watching masterclass.com. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was watching Steph Curry explain how to shoot a free throw.
I didn't know he was on there, but that's awesome.
Yeah, and he's awesome. He could deconstruct it down to the position of your feet. And I could, I could watch a genius in a particular area and see if I could learn something about improving my understandings of human communication and psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And so I continue to do that. Now, Erickson, like to see Mnuchin was just a peerless artist, and Irv Polster, at 96, 97, just an unbelievably astute human being. And everybody chooses a different angle from which to come to psychotherapy. If it's about cognition or body armor or attitude or relationship or symbolization, people choose different angles and they become experts within that area. And I wish that I had been able to have this way of thinking and to talk with Erickson about it during the years that I knew him, because it seemed to me that there was a kind of dissociative quality to Erickson where he could be reading a novel. He was very well read, extremely well read. They kept a list of every book that he had read from the 1920s through 1980 when he died. And Mrs. Erickson, they kept a list of every book that they read. It was an extensive undertaking, but they did it. And somehow Erickson understood what the grammar of what people were doing. Like the first time that I was there, he gave me a book, not a very good one, Nightmare Alley by William Gresham. And it's a story about a con man and the development, the rise and fall of this con man and how he was subject to his own weakness with alcohol. And Erickson gave me the book and said, read the first page, which I did. And he said, now tell me what it says on the last page. So I read the first page and looked at it. And I had no idea what it said on the last page. So I said, okay, what does it say? And he said that when he was given the book by his wife and daughter who liked the book, he read the first page and he told them what it said on the last page. And so I said, well, what does it say? He said, read the book. So I read the book and I got to the last page. I went back to the first page. I went, It was there, but I didn't know how to understand the grammatical understructure.
Yeah.
And so, I play this game with myself. And when I'm on an overseas flight, I watch 6, 7 movies, but only the introduction. And I try to see if I can learn the foreshadowing and I can make that so that it happens implicitly in my work and I'm not thinking about it. If Shakespeare wrote a metaphor, he wasn't thinking, now I'll be metaphoric. I think I'll use the Juliet as the sun metaphor, and I think I'll set it up by having Romeo say, what light in yonder window breaks, it's the east. He wasn't thinking about this. These things have become procedural memory. So I try to do things that will help me in my procedural understanding of the intricacies of communication and how to use those components by practicing them in working memory until they slip into procedural memory. So Erickson seemed to have practiced these things and did it assiduously. And I can remember him telling me about some of his early training where he would see a psychiatric patient and get a mental status examination, and then he would compose an intuited social history. And then he would get the social history from social work service and compare that to his intuitive social history. And he would do this for 100 patients. And then he would get a social history and he would write out an intuited mental status examination. And then he would write a 15-page induction for a patient, cut it down to 10 to 5 to 2. So this was like a great athlete who just over and over again is practicing something and not just being a slave to a protocol. One of the worst things that ever happened in the field of psychotherapy is taking insurance, which is one of the few countries in the world where you can use insurance for psychologists and counselors. Yeah. And this was a coup that the American Psychological Association had arranged parity with psychiatry and medicine. But then psychotherapists lost control of the field, and it now is run by businessmen who need to have a code and an empirically validated procedure in order for people to be reimbursed by insurance. So the way in which the field has developed has become antithetical to art and has become grounded in science, where if you don't have an empirically validated form of therapy, you can't be reimbursed. And this makes therapy into paint by numbers. And then what students of therapy want is, tell me the protocol. If it's a social phobia, give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as if psychotherapy can be as algorithmic as medicine. Medicine can be much more algorithmic than therapy can, because if you're dealing with a physical system, the rules are different than when you're dealing with a social system. Gregory Bateson, the great anthropologist, said in comparing physical and social systems, if you kick a rock, you can compute the acceleration, the velocity, the trajectory. But if you kick a dog, it's a completely different story. Social systems don't work the same as physical systems, and we've made psychotherapy into a physical system that has an algorithmic procedure, which in my estimation it doesn't, but I can't fight against the stream. And this is the way in which psychotherapy has developed, and the people who are working in institutions have to follow the yellow brick road.
Well, look, that was so many of, I mean, I could talk about that for the next hour. I don't have an hour, unfortunately.
Jordan, you've been great. And I thank you for the opportunity to allow me to expostulate.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want students to know about how they can contact you? Of course, there's the YouTube
it's
channel.
jeffreyzeig.com. You can learn about my teaching programs. The main thing is to go to the Erickson Foundation, erickson-foundation.org. My publishing company, Zeig Tucker, zeigtucker.com. And there's different resources in each one of those 3 websites that could be interesting. We have a couples conference, that's couplesconference.com. And that's happening in April on 5 different models of couples therapy: developmental model, Gottman model, EFT, a relational model, and the PACT model from Stan Tatkin. So people who want to learn about couples therapy, we do a regional conference in California every spring. And then this winter, we're doing the 13th Erickson Congress, which we traditionally hold in Phoenix. In 2020, we will do the evolution of psychotherapy, which is my main academic contribution to psychotherapy, bringing together the titular leaders of different schools of psychotherapy. We've had more than 8,000 people come to that conference. It's like Woodstock for psychotherapists. That's
It's a lot of fun.
evolutionofpsychotherapy.com in 2020 or ericksoncongress.com this December.
Okay. Well, look, thank you so much for your time.
Jordan, you've been great.
You're doing important work. Let us know when your books come out, and I'd be happy to pass it along.
Well, that's great. And bless you for what you're doing. And come visit us in Phoenix sometime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to.
Okay, super. Thank you so much.